Hey guys, I'm Michael, and today we are going to be learning how to knit. Now in this video we are going to be learning how to knit the garter stitch, not the purl stitch or any other stitch, the garter stitch. Now this would be done towards maybe the middle of the project. In the beginning of the project you will need to cast on, and at the end you'll need to cast off. But in this video we're only covering how to actually do the stitch work. If you want to know how to cast on or off, you should look at another video, which will come soon, so stay tuned. So in this video, we're going to be teaching you how to knit the garter stitch. Now the garter stitch, or almost any stitch for that matter, can be knitted in different ways. There is English and there's continental. In this case, we will only be covering one of those ways, most likely to be the English. So, today we are going to be learning how to knit. Now in this case we're using circular needles, which is maybe different from needles that are not connected with a cord, such as ours. And in this case, we are just going to be knitting down just straight piece of fabric. So now let's look a little more into depth about knitting. Now the first stitch, when you knit, you will always put your needle in and slide it off. That will be the first stitch in all of the cases. Only after that you can actually get to the real stitch work, which we'll now look into depth a little more. So that is how knitting would look. Now let's learn how to actually do it. So now in the garter stitch, first you would loop your needle into one of the loops. Next you loop your yarn over the needle. You would then grab the yarn with the needle and loop it through the first stitch, sliding the stitch that you just looped into off. So now let's try again. First you would loop the needle in, yarn goes over, and then as you can see, the hand movement there, pulling the stitch through. Now let's try again. Needle in, yarn over, yarn pulled out, loop off. Needle in, yarn over, yarn pulled out, yarn off. And just one last time. Needle in, yarn over, yarn pulled out, and yarn off. So that is how you knit the garter stitch. A little more quickly now we'll show you is when you really get good at this. Now don't worry, the first few times you may have curvy borders, and when I say curvy borders I do not mean straight borders. Now that is a tension problem. Don't worry, the more you knit, the less tension problem you will have. I have been knitting for, well, a couple of years now, and I have almost no tension problem. So a few things that you can do with knitting, and the difference between knitting and crocheting we will discuss more about in this video. So a few knitting projects you can do is you can make a scarf, you can make a hat, and you can make socks. Now to make socks you would need double pointed needles, 3, and this may be a little bit complicated for your beginner level. To make a hat you would need just the normal needles, there doesn't have to be anything special. And to make a scarf or a washcloth you just have to build upon, like in this case here when we have almost a scarf or washcloth. Now, a type of yarn that you should use. In this case we are using 7.5mm needles and the yarn of about 7 or 7.5 millimeters. Now it's better to start with a bulky weight yarn, which is usually bigger, as this is easier to knit with. And also, it's better to learn with bulky weight yarns first, because if you learn with smaller yarns, you may have trouble catching on to bulky weight yarns. So now we'll be discussing about what material you should use. Now most of the time, when you just begin, you shouldn't use any fancy material like wool. You should just use a normal everyday material, maybe acrylic or polyester. And now, to probably the last question of the day, what's the difference between knitting and crocheting? Now the difference is that knitting uses needles, 2 of which, and crocheting only uses a hook. Knitting is usually done for accessories to be wore and is usually more common in European countries where it's cold, as people would knit sweaters and scarves. Crocheting is usually, less common in European countries, more common in usually Asian countries, or not so cold countries, as in crocheting, what you're doing is you are building upon figurines. You could always make wearable accessories out of crocheting, but it won't be that comfortable. Crocheting is usually made for figurines or something of that sort. And then there is also the texture difference. Now, as you can see, between crocheting and knitting is more smooth and silky, while crocheting is more tough and rigid. A few examples of yarn that should and could be used are like this. This is a acrylic and polyester blend. This is just an acrylic blend. However, this yarn, as you can see, is really, really small, 2-3 millimeters, I'd say. So it shouldn't really be used when you begin. This is used for more of shawls, so yeah. These are what crochet needles would look like. And as you can see, they also come in different sizes. In this case, I have boy crochet needles, as you can see. And in this case, this needle here is 5.75 millimeters, while this needle is 7.5 millimeters. And as you can see, the difference between them is that this needle has a hook end, while this needle has more of a pointy, sharp end. Now, there are different types of needles. There are more pointy and more blunt needles. So more pointy needles would help you really dig into those loops, while more blunt needles, it wouldn't be as easy to dig into those loops. So that was how to knit. If you want to learn how to crochet, how to cast on, cast off, or even go more in depth about knitting, on what you should bring, and so forth, stay tuned. So thank you and goodbye, guys. That there was How to Knit 101.